nights tonight. The rain continues across northern parts and the North Midlands, eventually just skirting into the east of Northern Ireland. Either side of the rain there, it's a fairly dry night, but again, it will be cool. Temperatures widely dropping into single figures. So for Saturday then, if you're in Bristol, East Wales, Northern England, the Midlands and the east of Northern Ireland, it's not a great day for you. Grey skies, some very heavy rain, an inch or more falling in some spots. Either side of the band of rain though, it's a fairly decent day. Bright skies and sunshine, but feeling cool with a top temperature of 17. Bye for now.
This is BBC News. The headlines at 10 o'clock. I'm Matthew Emery-Waller covering events live here in Westminster, where the Prime Minister is trying to reassert his authority. Well, Gordon Brown is reshuffling his cabinet as we speak. Alistair Darling keeps his job as Chancellor, while Alan Johnson becomes the new Home Secretary. Well, that is the scene live in Downing Street, where the Prime Minister is putting together a new team of ministers following a series of high-profile resignations. Well, the latest, of course, James Purnell delivered a blow to the Prime Minister's authority after he called on him to quit, but Cabinet colleagues have criticised that decision.
I have a different decision. I think that the voices that we need to listen to are the voices of people who depend on a strong and effective and progressive Labour government.
There's extra pressure on Gordon Brown as the results from the local elections become clear. Labour losing out to the Conservatives and to the Liberal Democrats. A very good morning, live from Westminster, and Gordon Brown's reshuffle that was supposed to come on Monday, well, it is well underway here this morning. Not perhaps the reshuffle he might have planned, but one forced on him by last night's shock resignation of James Purnell. Well, the Health Secretary, Alan Johnson, is moved to the Home Office to replace Jackie Smith. That one of the early moves. Alistair Darling, well, he stays put in number 11 as Chancellor. The other confirmed post, Jack Straw, keeps his job as Justice Secretary. Alan Johnson takes over from Jackie Smith at the Home Secretary's berth, and that one of the key positions where Alan Johnson would go, the Business Secretary, Lord Mandelson. Well, he stays in place. He remains as Business Secretary. We've heard from him through the course of this morning, his reflections on James Purnell's resignation, but he stays as Business Secretary. Let's speak to our chief political correspondent, James Landale, who's there in Downing Street. Well, this has been brought forward, James, but it does seem to be going as planned without any sort of major hitches at the moment.
Well, so far, the bulk of the names that we know are those that are staying. The only big move is Alan Johnson to Home. At the moment, the bulk of the names we've got are those which are staying in place. Now we're getting to the really interesting bit, which is the big stage of the moves. We're going to have a new Health Secretary. We're going to have a new Work and Pension Secretary to replace James Purnell. And we also know that we're going to have a new Community Secretary to replace Hazel Blears. So we're at that stage now where the big moves are beginning to happen. No confirmation yet of who's going to get all of those particular jobs, because the process, as I say, is still underway. But this is the crucial bit where the younger members of the Cabinet are going to be asked, do you want this job? Where do you want to go? Are they all going to accept it? If at the end of the day we have a Cabinet that is agreed to every job they've been offered, there'll be no wrinkles, there'll be no rows, there'll be no unexpected delays in the middle of it like that, then I expect Gordon Brown and his people to come out and say, look, you know, the Prime Minister has asserted his authority, he has reshuffled the Cabinet in his own making, and therefore he has a united Cabinet, because he'll be able to say that he's spoken to them all today, they have all agreed to take the jobs, which they will, and those are the ones that will see him through to the end of his time in office. The risk he's got, of course, is if one of those ministers doesn't play ball and causes a problem by either refusing a job or saying, well, actually, I prefer to go over there in any way, in any sign of any kind of rebellion or at least disobedience to the Prime Minister.
OK, James, thanks once again. Well, already it's been a hugely busy, hugely dramatic morning here at Westminster. Let's just recap a little after 10 o'clock and see where we are this morning as that reshuffle continues. Let's hear from Ross Hawkins.
Behind Downing Street's closed door, the reshuffle is underway. The BBC understands Alistair Darling will stay as Chancellor, having fought successfully to save his job. And Alan Johnson is to replace Jackie Smith as Home Secretary. The reshuffle was brought forward after the Work Secretary, James Purnell, resigned and said Gordon Brown should go too. The papers printed a resignation in which he told the Prime Minister, "I now believe your continued leadership makes a Conservative victory more, not less likely." He goes on, "I am therefore calling on you to stand aside to give our party a fighting chance of winning." But this minister, who is expected to keep his job in the reshuffle, was one of many who said James Purnell had got it wrong.
We've just gone through as a party 3 significant election victories. We won those elections not by turning in on ourselves, not by breaking ranks, and not by imploding in the way that I'm afraid James's actions could possibly lead to.
I'm very sad that James Purnell has left the government. He's a good friend of mine. He has outstanding achievements to his credit as a minister, and he had big ideas for the future. And he's obviously a big and serious person, and I think it's a loss to the government. However, I don't share the judgment that he made.
Opposition politicians said this proved Britain needed a general election.
Good morning. Well, I think the events of the last 2 days show that this government has completely forfeited its right to govern. Anyone watching these events would just be asking what has happened to the authority of the government, what has happened to the authority of the Prime Minister.
Whether Gordon Brown stays, whether Gordon Brown goes, whether someone replaces him, it's all irrelevant because the Labour government has run out of road. It's finished.
James Purnell has left Gordon Brown's side, but in Downing Street they're hoping a reshuffle rather than another resignation will be enough to bolster the government. Ross Hawkins, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's speak to Cabinet Minister Shaun Woodward, who joins me here at Westminster.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for being with me. Is this reshuffle all about political survival?
Not at all. This is a reshuffle to ensure that the government addresses the problems the country most need, the problem of the recession and the problem of the expenses crisis at Westminster. And what I think Gordon is doing, from what we seem to be seeing this morning, is ensuring that we have the right people to take this country through a recession which arguably is the toughest set of challenges this country has faced since the 1930s.
You're asking people who are watching this to look there and think this is nothing to do with Gordon Brown.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is about Gordon ensuring that the government addresses the problems of the country. Questions about individuals are not the issues he's addressing, they're about policy, and he's having the right people in place to carry out the policy.
You're with me here, so let me ask you, do you continue as Northern Ireland Secretary? Do you know what you're doing?
He hasn't asked me to do anything else. I wait for a call, or I perhaps don't have a call, in which case I go on serving in Northern Ireland, and that's what I'm here to do. Serve the country, serve the Prime Minister, and do what I'm asked to do.
What did you make of the resignation of your colleague last night?
I'm just very disappointed by James's decision, but that's a matter for him. The Prime Minister is moving it on this morning, sorting the government out so we get on with the business of running the country.
Of course it's a matter for him, but you will have read the text of his letter and talking about the party that he loves, that Gordon Brown loves, and his assessment that actually for the best of the party and the best of the country, Prime Minister too should go.
I think James is wrong about that, and I think the country needs a man of the mettle of Gordon Brown, the authority of Gordon Brown, and a man who has the policies to get us through the recession.
And then you twin that and other cabinet resignations with what we are hearing in the early results from the local elections, another dire night for the government. I mean, if you put all of that together, isn't that just a fundamental message that you are getting?
No, the fundamental message I'm getting is the country wants a Prime Minister to get them through the recession. And Gordon Brown is the right man to do that as leader of the Labour Party and as Prime Minister. My job and my colleagues' job is to serve the country. Well, I think he does have the authority, and I think the decision of James last night was a mistake. But what we're seeing today is a cabinet coming behind Gordon Brown, a reshuffle underway, a reshuffle to serve the country. That's our job, and that's what we should do.
You think he has the authority after Hazel Blair's walked out with a resignation, not even mentioning the Prime Minister on the eve of these important election results? You think he has the authority after James Purnell says, look, I've sat there around Cabinet, and I think for the good of the country, he has to go. You think he has the authority with all of those backbenchers talking about circulating letters and scores of MPs signed? You think he has the authority?
What I think he has is the mettle to get this country through the problems that we have in the recession.
That's just talking about that
and with huge
stubbornness.
with huge respect, that's not why people from the G20 countries came to London a month ago to learn how Gordon Brown was actually getting Britain through the recession. Yes, he does have the authority. What we have to do now is unite behind him and serve the country.
Do you know what? I was reminded this morning as I was listening to all of it, watching the events of the last few days, watching the events of last night, of Donald Dewar at John Smith's funeral, where he was trying to describe the loss to the party, to the country. He said, the people know it because they can feel it.
Yep.
This government is finished. The people know it. They can feel it.
No, that's what some media commentators are saying. That's what the leaders of the opposition are saying. What I know and what I can feel is that Gordon Brown has the mettle to get this country through the recession. And that's what we should all be here in public life to do, to help the country and not ourselves.
Why is the early message then from the local election results in line with that feeling? I mean, big losses for the Labour Party in some key areas. Why is that message there coming from the electorate as well?
Well, with huge respect to you, we are in the middle of a recession. You would expect a government at a time like this to have severe difficulty. I remember when I was in the Conservative Party more than 10 years ago in 1991, the Conservative Party in that year had catastrophic local election results. I don't think ours are going to be catastrophic. I think they'll be tough. But the fact of the matter is John Major went on to win a general election. And I believe when the time comes and the Prime Minister judges that time to be right, the country can make up its mind. But Gordon Brown is going to get this country through a recession. That's what matters to people up and down this country, and that's the job for all of us.
Just as you were speaking there, I was hearing that Sir Alan Sugar, and we've heard from him already through the course of this morning, he's been offered a position as an enterprise czar, which comes as a peerage in terms of, I suppose, consultation, help in all those areas that you were talking about with the recession. Your thoughts on that particular appointment?
Well, if that's right, and again, this is speculation at this stage, I think it shows again somebody who wants to serve their country and who's prepared to do what a Prime Minister asks to help the country. And if that is correct, I think it says reams about Sir Alan Sugar, and I think it says reams about the authority of a Prime Minister when he asks somebody like that they're willing to serve.
Why is it, do you think, that the public should be convinced when members of Gordon Brown's own cabinet are clearly not?
Once again, you're asking me the question another set of ways, but I'll tell you this. My colleagues want to serve the country. Gordon Brown has policies to get this country through a recession and deal with the expenses crisis. Let's back him, let's unite him, and let's work for the good of the country.
I don't think there's any doubt about some of the big issues that need to be addressed. The recession is one, affecting people's jobs, incomes. The way this place works is the other.
Sure.
There's no doubt about that across all of the parties.
So
the fundamental question is the Labour Party in its current position the party able to deal with those big issues?
Well, that is a question for the Labour Party, and members of the Labour Party have got to ask themselves this morning, will they renew and redouble their efforts to work for the country? My view is that they will, and the members of the Cabinet will unite behind this Prime Minister, this leader of the party, to ensure that we serve our country. That's our job, and we've got to get on and do it.
And what would you say to all of those backbenchers that we have been hearing about, all those talk about circulating letters, who make the assessment that actually this party is heading for a disaster at the next general election, and however painful, personally, politically, the better move for the Labour Party is to get rid of Gordon Brown and have a new person to take you into that next election, to deal with all of those things that you have been talking about.
Well, if some have reached that judgment, I disagree with them. I believe that Gordon Brown is the right person to get the country through it. And what the members of the Labour Party and the PLP have got to ask themselves is actually what best serves the country. And I have no doubt about that. It's the man who actually brought the leaders of the world, the President Obama, to the G20 to London to learn how to help the people of this country get through a recession. This is the right man to lead the party.
Just a final thought, because of course you're in Cabinet, you're Northern Ireland Secretary at the moment, you said earlier that you haven't had any conversations because there are rumours that you might be heading towards Defence, the Ministry of Defence.
I've had many conversations with the Prime Minister about Northern Ireland in the last few days, many conversations about helping the country get through the recession. If the Prime Minister wants to talk to me about the job I'm doing in Northern Ireland or any other job, I think he knows where to find me.
And just in terms of the events, because we have the European elections coming Monday, we've had to reshuffle now in advance of that, and of course all of the indications are another set of very bad results anticipated for you on Monday. Do you anticipate this man, Gordon Brown, actually being able to get through this weekend and the coming days and the coming weeks?
Without question, yes.
Without a challenge? Or do you anticipate that there may be a challenge that he will have to see on?
Well, that's a matter for other people. What those people have got to ask themselves is, who do they actually believe will best get this country through the challenges we face as a country? And I simply go back to saying that's why the world leaders came here for the G20, to see what Gordon Brown was doing to help Britain. I believe we should back Gordon Brown as leader and as Prime Minister of this country, and I hope my colleagues all do the same.
I don't want to push your patience, but just a really final question. Have you had any sort of phone call from Downing Street this morning yourself?
I've had no phone calls from Downing Street this morning.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time. Let's head to Downing Street, because all of those phone calls, all of those decisions are currently being made there. That is the scene from our helicopters there at number 10, because we've had some of the big names being confirmed to the BBC this morning, and that news that we were just talking about in the last few minutes, that Sir Alan Sugar will be an enterprise czar with a peerage that comes with it, and that's one of the early indications that are coming in that reshuffle. But obviously more of those names we will learn in the coming minutes, and that the scene there from the helicopter, and we will return to James Landale, who's there and getting very early steers in terms of the makeup of that cabinet. We'll talk to him in the next few minutes. Well, I think we're heading to James in a second or two, but before we do that, let's speak to Vernon Bogdanor from Oxford University. Thank you very much, Professor of Politics and Government there. And well, if it's possible to take a step back in another dramatic morning, what is your assessment of where we are?
It's beginning to look as if Gordon Brown is able to achieve his cabinet reshuffle. That's his first hurdle. His next hurdle will come on Monday when we get the local election results. And if they're poor for Labour, which of course is very possible, then he may have to face problems from the parliamentary party. So he's not yet completely over the hump, but he's over the first hurdle.
So it was crucial to actually get this reshuffle right, and but more problems potentially Monday. But was this, in your view, the big problem?
I think it probably was. Margaret Thatcher was brought down in 1990 because her cabinet ministers simply told her to go, led by Kenneth Clarke. Now, that could have happened to Gordon Brown after James Purnell's resignation yesterday, but it hasn't happened. It looks as if he's managed to avoid that particular problem. That was a great hurdle that he's now overcome.
As you were giving me that answer, I was just hearing that Jim Murphy, the Scottish Secretary, is to stay, and a lot of those are actually staying in the position he currently holds. So Jim Murphy staying put, and the very latest word on David Miliband. All the indications are that he will stay as Foreign Secretary. Only a few days ago, we were talking, actually, or hearing, the possibility of this being a savage reshuffle, a huge reshuffle. But actually, if you look across the piece now, with the Chancellor staying put, the Foreign Secretary staying put, the Business Secretary staying put, well, it's anything but a massive reshuffle, isn't it?
It may be that Gordon Brown wanted a savage reshuffle, but his hand has been forced. And he must be very grateful that he's got a cabinet together at all, because there was the possibility last night that it wouldn't happen, that his government would simply disintegrate.
How real a possibility?
I think it was a real possibility, with a resignation of 3 cabinet ministers in a row, quite unprecedented in modern times. The government could just have collapsed from inside, but he's managed to pull things together, so for the moment he survives.
What are your thoughts on a broader strategy other than just survival, buying time then? If he gets over this hump, Danny Finkelstein, I was talking to him earlier, was saying actually if he gets through this weekend, he probably gets through the year to the next election. Is that an analysis you would share?
That's very possible. He's got two problems to deal with. The first is the expenses row. He's got to restore the authority of MPs and Parliament in the country. He's got to tell the country how he's going to deal with that and to put in train measures to reform Parliament. Secondly, of course, we've all forgotten it during this crisis, he's got to deal with the recession. He's got to get us out of that, put forward economic measures to deal with those problems. They're the two main issues facing him. We've tended to forget them in the last day or two, but of course they're still there, lurking in the background.
Well, Professor, thanks for those thoughts and thanks for being with me. Well, we were saying only a few moments ago that Jim Murphy stays in post as Secretary of State for Scotland. I'm glad to say that he is ready to speak to us now, live here on BBC News, and we're very grateful for your time. Good morning.
Good morning.
So you stay put?
Well, I'm very pleased about that. I read it on the BBC News there. I'm joking. I spoke to the Prime Minister this morning and I'd said that I was very keen to stay on as Secretary of State for Scotland. There's a big job to be done here in Scotland to get Scotland through the recession, and I'm delighted that the Prime Minister has been generous enough to allow me to stay on.
You said you've spoken to the Prime Minister. You're one of his close political friends. What was his mood like this morning when you spoke to him?
Gordon Brown is a very determined man. I spoke to him last evening and I spoke to him again this morning. He is determined to get on with the job. He's certain not to be distracted, notwithstanding the difficulties, of course, the country faces, but he's determined to get on with the job and see our country through this recession, a recession that we all know, all your viewers know, is affecting every country across the world. And I believe very strongly that he's the right man to get us through this recession.
You said there 2 or 3 times that he was determined to keep going. I mean, that's one way of describing it. Of course, the flip side would just be say that he is stubborn. You will have seen in that resignation letter from James Purnell his assessment that for the best of the party, for the best of the country, the Prime Minister should perhaps think about stepping aside. Why is James Purnell wrong?
Well, I'm a very good friend of James Purnell's and I will continue to be, but I disagree with what he did. And I've said that to him. Now, the fact is that the country faces this recession, and I don't want to go into that in detail because you'd rightly say, look, let's concentrate on the issue today, but there's a big recession across the world, and there's also the backdrop of this expenses scandal where the public are furious with members of Parliament who've abused the expenses system. I think the Prime Minister has already shown that he can get on top of this expenses scandal, and he can, of course, get us through this recession in a way that Mr Cameron just could not.
Jim, stay there, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I will come back to you in a second, but we are learning that John Hutton is to leave the Cabinet. He, of course, is the Defence Secretary at the moment. He has decided to go back onto the backbenchers. He leaves as Defence Secretary, and, of course, John Hutton was one of the key Blairites, who was always seen very much in that camp in the way that, I suppose, politics for the last decade and a half has been divided into Brownites and Blairites. He was one of those people that Gordon Brown was very keen to keep within Cabinet when he first came in because of those connections, and all of those calculations have been made in the past. But John Hutton, we are told, he's been, the sources telling the BBC that he will leave Cabinet and that position as Defence Secretary. We're speaking only a short while to Shaun Woodward, and that was one of the rumours swirling around this place that perhaps Shaun Woodward moves to Defence in his place. But we wait for confirmation as to who succeeds John Hutton. Let's go back to Jim Murphy, and sorry to break away from you, but that another of the big names that we are learning about. What is your assessment? Are we seeing a parting of the ways? We've seen Hazel Blears go. We've seen James Purnell. We've seen now John Hutton. Is there the divide reappearing there again in the party?
No, I don't think that's what's happening. John Hutton, if this news is confirmed, I am certain will be a very loyal Labour Member of Parliament from the backbenches. He's been an excellent Secretary of State for Defence, and before that, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. I'm certain that he today will confirm his continued support and very strong support for Gordon Brown, and the fact that the party now has to come together in support not just of a Prime Minister, but to show that it has the determination and the courage to stay in government. Look, divided parties lose elections, that's absolutely certain. But we have, I believe, got the right set of policies to get us through the recession, and I believe also that we have the right Prime Minister to get us through it as well.
Sorry, on that point, because you used the phrase divided parties lose elections. At the moment, you are divided and you're heading for a huge loss, aren't you?
Well, the public will decide that when the election comes, but of course we're giving the impression of being divided, and we've got to get our act together. And I think it's about getting our act together and supporting Gordon Brown as Prime Minister and the policies and the team that he wants to lead on. Look, there is a big divide in British politics, more so than for many years, between a Conservative Party and a Labour Party. A Conservative Party that is committed to really significant cuts in the teeth of a recession, and a Labour Party committed to continued investment and, of course, sensible savings where we can make them. But there's a big divide in British politics in a way that we haven't seen for many years, and politics is worth fighting for, worth voting for, and worth campaigning for.
I don't think anyone disagrees with that, and there are big issues that all the various parties have their ideas on how to approach. And you mentioned John Hutton. It's worth me actually saying, because I didn't a moment or two ago, he's made it absolutely clear his support for Gordon Brown as he leaves the Cabinet. So exactly your assessment that you were making there, Jim. But if you take a step back as a politician and look at it through the eyes of the public, I mean, they must view this government as the wheels coming off. Every day we see a different Cabinet Minister resign. We hear about backbenchers circulating letters with names pleading for him to go. And all the while, people are trying to hold down jobs, trying to get through difficult times. Is it not fair for them to think, well, this lot seem finished, I'll vote for somebody else?
Well, we'll see how the votes have been cast in these European elections, but based on the opinion polls, of course, the public looked as if they were going to give us a bloody nose. And the fact is, we've got to look at those results and re-energise ourselves. I think the reshuffle today will help.
You always say that. I was on the green with you a year ago, and you were saying exactly the same thing.
I don't think I did. If you rewind your tape, you'll see that I didn't say exactly the same. But I know that the election results in these European elections will be very difficult for the Labour Party. I know that very clearly. And we've got to look and see just why is it so many of the public may have voted against us in these European elections. But one of the things is undoubtedly the recession. Another is the scandal of the expenses system. But another is that we've got to set out a clear vision about why you should have a fourth term of a Labour government. And we've got to do that much more strongly and much more effectively. And I think then the contrast between Gordon Brown as Prime Minister and David Cameron as a possible alternative will be stark indeed. And the public, I suspect, would go for substance over Mr. Cameron's carefully crafted spin.
Jim Murphy, we're grateful for your time. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go straight back to Downing Street, because all the while we're getting new information. James Landell is our chief political correspondent. James, tell us more, and start first of all with John Hutton.
Yeah, fascinating decision. That is now the fourth resignation from Gordon Brown's cabinet in the last week. Not just Hazel Blair's Jackie Smith and obviously James Purnell, but obviously now John Hutton. Fascinating decision for two reasons. First of all, John Hutton is making it very clear that he's been thinking about this for some time. He's resigning to spend time on the backbenches, and he is making it very clear that this is not an attack on Gordon Brown. He's not going to be making the similar sort of statement that James Purnell has made. However, John Hutton is somebody who was seen as a firm mover and shaker within the Blairite camp, very close to Tony Blair, has been known in the past to have been critical of Gordon Brown's leadership, both in public and in private. And even though he is making it clear that his resignation is not a criticism of the Prime Minister, the simple fact that you now have a Defence Secretary who has decided to resign while Britain is fighting two wars overseas and has decided that he doesn't want to spend the next year of his life, or however long it may be, working to defend Gordon Brown's government, is just another indication that people out there, MPs and ministers, are making personal decisions about their own future, about what they want to do, which is an indication, a symbol of a government that is beginning to reach the end of its time. It's not, as Mr. Hutton is making clear, this is not a direct attack on the Prime Minister, but the simple fact that John Hutton is choosing not to serve his Prime Minister is a signal in itself.
Yes, it's very interesting, and you were going through the list of people who were always associated with Tony Blair, Hazel Blears, James Purnell, and now John Hutton, because the accusation certainly levelled at Gordon Brown is that the more difficult things become, the more he's inclined to go into the bunker.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the great risk that at a time like this, that governments, people in Downing Street, they enclose themselves, they become more defensive about everything. If you talk to anybody who is closely involved with the Conservatives at the dying embers of the John Major government, they'll always say that there's an eerie calm at the centre of government as the crisis explodes around you, both in the media and in Parliament, but at the same time, the bunker mentality sometimes overtakes clear, calm decision-making. I think what they will be attempting to do today as they go through this reshuffle, as they make the calls, as they try and get all the ducks in a row, that they don't make those kind of mistakes. That's what they will clearly be trying to do. This resignation by John Hutton is clearly something that has put an oar in the spokes, if you like. The question that is fascinating is, has John Hutton simply announced this to the Prime Minister today, or has the Prime Minister known about it for some time? If he's known about it for a while, he will have been able to have dealt with it and actually accommodated it in the reshuffle. If John Hutton has simply left it till today, then there will be a very large Defence Secretary-shaped hole currently in the Cabinet list, and a few heads will be scratched and a few names might be changed.
OK, James, thanks once again. Well, you're watching BBC News live from Westminster. The time is exactly 10:30, so if you've just joined us in the last few minutes, let's just recap what has been another of those hectic political mornings, because we have a reshuffle currently going away as we wait for those local election results to actually come in through the course of this morning. But Gordon Brown has been rushed into a reshuffle of his cabinet after that resignation that we saw last night from James Purnell, the Work and Pensions Secretary. It's being seen as an attempt to stamp his authority on the party as Prime Minister. Now he's moved Alan Johnson, who's seen by many as a future Labour leader, from Health to be in charge at the Home Office. So Alan Johnson moves from Health to the Home Office. In the other moves, the BBC understands that Peter Mandelson will keep his job as Business Secretary. Jack Straw stays as Justice Secretary. Alistair Darling, well, he remains, despite everything we've seen in the last few days. He stays at number 11. It had been thought that Gordon Brown wanted to move him. Well, speculation about Mr. Brown's future as the Prime Minister intensified last night with that sudden resignation of the Work and Pension Secretary, James Purnell. He said Mr. Brown should also step down for the good of the Labour Party. And the early results we've had in from the English local council election suggest Labour has suffered a sharp drop in their share of the vote. The Conservatives took the new unitary council of central Bedfordshire, where Labour didn't win a single seat. The Liberal Democrats have taken control of the City Council in Bristol. Well, you're right up to date as we move back to the helicopter over Westminster, and let me tell you that let's speak to Tessa Jowell now, who's joined me here on the green. And Tessa, we'll come to John Hutton in a second, but can I ask you first of all, have you heard at all yourself from the Prime Minister this morning?
No, I haven't.
And are you expecting to?
I have no idea. That's the nature of a reshuffle. It's fraught with uncertainty. I have no idea.
Tessa, do stay with me, and apologies to break it with you so suddenly, but we're going to go to the BBC's political editor, Nick Robinson. And Nick, tell us more in terms of where we are. 10:30 already. So much has happened through the course of the morning. What is your assessment?
Well, I think the decision that BBC News Channel broke this morning of John Hutton, the Defence Secretary, to stand down from the Cabinet, becoming the fourth Cabinet member to do so, and yet to do so while endorsing Gordon Brown's continued leadership, in a sense tells you everything about what today is about. John Hutton, remember, was one of Tony Blair's closest allies. He was, in advance of Gordon Brown's leadership, one of his most fiercest critics. He decided to serve him. He is now standing down, but he is not joining James Purnell in calling for a change of leadership. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that there are people who've had their real doubts about Gordon Brown, but nevertheless simply do not agree with James Pennell that now is the time to change the leadership of the Labour Party. Do not agree that that is the only way to avoid electoral defeat. Now, John Hutton's decision was taken a number of weeks ago, I'm told, that he did tell the Prime Minister, and he is also planning to stand down from Parliament and to pursue other projects. But Mr Hutton would have been one of those ministers who, had he chosen to do so, could have helped bring the Gordon Brown down, could have helped change the Prime Minister of this country. He's decided not to do so. And alongside the decisions of David Miliband to back Gordon Brown and Alan Johnson to do so, those three men are the symbol of why Gordon Brown will still be leader of the Labour Party at the end of today, has hopes of still being leader of the Labour Party next week that even 12 hours ago he may not have had.
OK, Nick, thanks very much for that, or listening to that. Tessa Jowland, sorry to break away from you, but Nick, giving us a little more of the detail there of John Hutton's departure, making it clear that John Hutton is not joining James Pennell as to one of those calling for a change at the top, a change with Gordon Brown. What is your assessment? You know John very well in terms of this particular move to stand down, to resign from government.
I think that I obviously didn't know he was resigning. I haven't heard all the the analysis and exactly what his reasons are, but that's completely plausible to me. That he has a family, and John has been in government for. I think John has been in government for 11, 12 years. I think almost since we were elected back in 1997, and he is at a point where he just wants to give more time to his family, and he's got a lovely family, lovely wife, lovely family. He wants them to have more time.
It's interesting though, in the last few days we've seen the exit of Hazel Blears, John Hutton, of James Pennell, all those thought to be close to Tony Blair. Are we seeing Gordon Brown retreat back to the bunker with those all were seen within the Brown camp?
Well, look, there are three. I think there are sort of three elements to that. First of all, each of these resignations has been occasioned by different circumstances. That's the first point. Second, Gordon Brown is reshuffling his cabinet today. There will be a new government by the end of today or tomorrow. The obligation on every member of that government is to stop the Westminster frenzy and obsessing about ourselves, turn out, face the people of this country and engage with them about the things that they want government to do for them. And I hope that in appointing his government, Gordon will, as I think he will, recognise the importance of breadth and covering a very wide spectrum of opinion. That's healthy government.
And we've already heard the confirmation of some of those big players. We know Alistair Darling is staying in place. It looks like David Miliband is also staying in place. Yeah, I'm sure you'll sort of do a checklist on all of them. I'd be surprised if you say something is not a good thing. But it's interesting because Nick finished in that answer talking about it's a reshuffle that gets him through being Prime Minister at the end of the day. It's an extraordinary thing to actually consider that perhaps that was at peril at some stage.
Well, look, this is apocalyptic stuff by Nick. 4 members of the cabinet have said for different reasons that they think it's time to go. So, of course, they have to be replaced.
But let's be straight about it. Had any of those key players we were talking about, Alistair Darling, David Miliband, Alan Johnson, decided they didn't want to take part in whatever the plan was, you talk about it being apocalyptic, it was the end.
Yeah, but they're not. They're continuing to serve in the government under Gordon Brown. That's the important thing. There's not really much value in speculating on what if. Each of those three.
No, I'm just making the point of how close to the edge that we have actually got.
Well, but I don't actually think that that's the case. We've got a parliamentary majority of 66. Gordon Brown is the leader and he's the Prime Minister, and we have got a programme of work to do. That's much more prosaic and less interesting to the media than the job of actually getting on with government.
So it's hardly a media story, though, is it? Because, you have James Pennell coming out and saying this is not the right person to lead the party, lead the country?
No, look, I'm not denying that for one moment. I'm very sorry that James has resigned. I think James is an enormous talent, and I think that he leaves a very significant legacy that unemployed people up and down this country will continue to benefit from. And I think he deserves an enormous amount of respect for that. But this is difficult, but being in government often is very difficult. But government succeeds when people pull together as one team behind the Prime Minister. That's what we've got to do.
But has the Prime Minister, do you think, got the authority to actually go on now and deal with some of those big issues? I mean, we all know what they are. All the parties have different ideas of actually how you tackle it.
Yes,
has he got the authority to actually get on with it and tackle those?
Yes, because he is the Prime Minister. And in ministers accepting appointment to the government, they also accept that.
Just a final thought. I mean, personally, I've been in politics for a very long time, and you see what is going on. We haven't even got to local council election results, which are pretty dire by all the early indications. I mean, what do you think? I mean, aren't the public right to look at all of this and think, well, this lot seem to be turning on themselves, have run out of ideas, look exhausted, the wheels are off. Perhaps we'll go somewhere else. Why is that a wrong analysis for people out there to...
We're not exhausted. We've still got we've got a big programme of change that we want to bring forward with people, not just constitutional change, but, to continue upgrading, modernising schools, hospitals, policing, making people feel safer, and so forth. This is if you like, the mundane job of government, but it's what we all came into politics because only politics can deliver, these big changes in people's lives. And after the turbulence of yesterday and today, I hope that we will have a government that will get on with that job, and the temperature will drop, the sense of frenzy will drop, and what people at home will know is that we're talking to them, preoccupied by them and their needs, and not the exceptional and extraordinary circumstances of the last 3 weeks.
Okay. Tessa Jowell, thanks for being with me here this morning. And just to recap where we are as we look at those pictures from above Westminster from the helicopter, because the reshuffle, well, it is well underway at number 10. And that news that you're seeing there on the screen, feeding into the reshuffle, that news that John Hutton, the Defence Secretary, has decided to leave the government, the fourth member of the government in recent days to actually resign. He's made it clear that he continues to support Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, so not joining James Purnell. That's worth underlining, not joining James Purnell in calling for a change of the Prime Minister. But John Hutton is to leave Cabinet. James Landale there in Westminster, who's been giving us all the very latest twists and turns of the reshuffle, was making the point about how far in advance this news was actually known, because if the Prime Minister has first heard about it in the hours this morning, that perhaps potentially leaves a hole in one of the plans the Prime Minister might have had. Had he known in the days leading up to this that this was John Hutton's plan, then perhaps he would have made preparations for that eventuality. But all will become clear in the coming hours as we get the full cabinet reshuffle. But certainly the big beasts of the party, most of them appear to be staying put in their current positions, although we've seen Alan Johnson moving from health to the Home Office. Let's speak now to Ken Livingstone, former Mayor of London, who's joined here with me. What do you make of what is going on?
Well, I mean, there's been a small group of ultra-Blairites who never wanted Gordon Brown, all the rows from the past, and they've been disaffected. They've now gone. I think the government that will come out of this is one that's not quite got those divides in it. And I think once this weekend's over and the rolling news caravan moves on, we'll be back to what really matters, which is what needs to be done to lift us as rapidly as possible out of this recession.
Talk about lifting the country out of the recession. Where do you think the party, the government, is in terms of its standing? Because, of course, we're going to get the local election results, but where are we?
Labour's had an absolute pasting. But it's not had an absolute pasting because Gordon Brown didn't look terribly good on YouTube. It's because millions of ordinary Labour voters have been disgusted to discover some of the people they really respected have had their snout in the trough, not actually breaking the law, but pushing it right up to the limit. That's why we've done badly. And the one thing everyone accepts about Gordon Brown, he never came into politics to line his pockets. With the passing of this, the replacement of those people, will get the government back on track.
The expenses is cross-party. Why do you blame all the woes that
Well,
you're
there's
currently
two
sitting
reasons.
with
If
polling?
you're in government, you get the blame.
On that.
You get the blame. But also the way the Telegraph has dripped and dripped it out has been to cause maximum damage to the Labour Party. I mean, we could take out an even bigger one that we all had to pay for out of our taxes.
But why wouldn't the assessment be perfectly justified to actually say, well, people have looked across the piece, the expenses is clearly part of it, but looked across the piece in terms of the way he's handled everything, and this government has handled everything, and it's an assessment on that, right across the board, that they don't think they're performing well on any of it.
That's why I don't think we're going to have the absolute meltdown that some people are predicting. It's a bad set of results for Labour, because leave aside all the flim-flam about expenses on the key issue, preventing this recession turning into another Great Depression like the 30s. Brown put together the policies, got America and Europe behind them, and has been the crucial international player. And over this next year, I think we will see Britain coming out of that recession, and he will get the credit for it. And if I'd heard any of these Uber Blairites telling me about different policies they wanted, that might be more of an interest, but it's all personality.
You say that, but I mean, you sat on the backbenches for such a long time here. You will be aware of those moves, the unhappiness on the backbenches, not just the cabinet members, not just people who you might box in as Blairite, Brownites. The backbenches, and we have all of that business about letters, emails circulating, still to find out what is going to be done. That is very real.
In any party, you'll have a quarter to a third of the backbenchers aren't happy with the government. They haven't had a job, or they had a job and they've been put back on the backbenches. There's nothing unusual about it. No one ever said in politics they like each other. They're there to do business. And I think once we get through this and people see that there isn't anybody that does better. I mean, all the polling, no one's shown us a poll that says if you get rid of Brown and have X, Y or Z, Labour's bound to win. The truth is, I think that for all the disagreements I've had with Gordon Brown, he's most likely to get Labour into a better position for the next election than anybody else.
But it comes back to individual personal circumstances, isn't it? Because you know what the calculations that MPs make at this stage of Parliament when they see the polling. They want to keep their jobs. And they're making the assessment, perhaps if there is a change in the coming weeks and months, they have a better chance of hanging on. The damage is less.
They're not making that assessment because no polling has demonstrated that anyone will do better than Brown. And therefore, once this dreadful week of news moves on to next week and new issues, it will come back to the focus on what's Brown doing to lift Britain out of the recession as rapidly as possible.
But I made the point to Jim Murphy when I was talking to him. I stood here exactly a year ago with the last set of local elections.
Mine.
Yes, indeed. And the same points were being made there, that this government had to be given the time to tackle the recession, that it would come good, that those were longer-term difficulties, that they were listening to what the voters were saying, and yet 12 months on, they seem to be in exactly the same position, if not worse.
I think it is worse, but it's worse because of the shock of the expenses scandal, and because Labour's in government, it gets the worst of that. And I think a lot of people I've been genuinely shocked by some of the people I dealt with as mayor while they were ministers to see what they've been getting up to. And Brown's got to lance that boil, get rid of those people who've not broken the law but pushed it to the limit.
Okay, Ken Livingstone, thanks for being here with me this morning. Thanks very much. Well, that reshuffle that we were talking about, well, that is still going on. We've had many of the big names in the cabinet, it becoming pretty clear what their position is, many staying in post. Let's just recap in terms of the names we know, because we know this is an absolutely critical reshuffle for the Prime Minister and reasserting his authority. Well, one of the first moves that we learned about this morning, the Home Secretary's job. Well, Jackie Smith making it clear she was going. Well, Alan Johnson from Health takes over there as Home Secretary. We also understand that Alistair Darling, well, he is going to stay as Chancellor as the government continues to try to get the country out of recession. We'd heard those reports earlier in the week saying he didn't want any other job within Cabinet. He would prefer to actually leave Cabinet rather than actually move out of number 11 and go, say, to Defence or the Home Office. But he's dug his heels in, apparently, and he stays there as Chancellor. Jack Straw, well, he was the first name we learned about. He stays as Justice Secretary. He said this morning that Gordon Brown is the best man to lead the party. Peter Mandelson, the Business Secretary, well, there had been talk of him perhaps moving to become Foreign Secretary. No, he stays put too. He stays there as Business Secretary, a role, remember, in the last reshuffle, Gordon Brown's successful reshuffle, where he surprised everyone when he brought Peter Mandelson back into the Cabinet specifically for that role as Business Secretary. Well, he stays put and continues to do that job. I referred to Jim Murphy a moment or two ago, the BBC learning that he remains as Scotland Secretary. Mr Murphy is the latest Cabinet Minister pledging his loyalty to the Prime Minister. And, of course, in the last few minutes, we have learned that the Defence Secretary, John Hutton, says he's standing down from the government. He's resigning from government for family reasons. He is making it clear that he is backing Gordon Brown's continued leadership. That is important, obviously, after what we saw with James Pennell, after also the knowledge that he was always seen as one of the big supporters of Tony Blair, very much from that camp. But he was kept on in that first reshuffle of Gordon Brown, became one of the staunch allies of Gordon Brown. But he has decided at this moment that he is now going to leave government and is standing aside there as Defence Secretary. There is some speculation that perhaps Sean Woodward, who currently is the Northern Ireland Secretary, will get the defence job. That is just speculation. I asked him about it a little earlier. He said it is still to be made clear. He's not had a phone call from Downing Street. The Foreign Secretary, again, he's another of those names where all the indications suggesting he will stay in place, David Miliband, at the Foreign Office. He's been talking to reporters and he thought that Gordon Brown, well, he had this assessment of the Prime Minister's position.
This is a difficult time for anyone involved in politics. There are no easy decisions. I'm very sad that James Pennell has left the government. He's a good friend of mine. He has outstanding achievements to his credit as a minister, and he had big ideas for the future. And he's obviously a big and serious person, and I think it's a loss to the government. However, I don't share the judgment that he made. I have a different decision. I think that the voices that we need to listen to are the voices of people who depend on a strong and effective and progressive Labour government. I think we need to listen to the voices of people who are going out to work today, who are looking after their kids, who are worried about care for their parents. So today is a day for working, not resigning, and that's what I'm going to do.
Can I ask, what does the PM need to do to hold things together, to keep people together and not rebels, you know?
Well, I think that Britain needs strong and progressive government more than ever. And I think that the Prime Minister and the rest of us have a big responsibility to provide that. And that applies on the domestic scene and on the international scene. I think that there are big challenges facing the country, not just in politics, but in economics as well. And I think that we do have the ideas, and we have to show the people of this country that we're able to provide the sort of leadership that they need. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, that was David Miliband. Let's hear from the Conservative leader, because he was out very early talking to reporters, insisting yet again that the country needs a general election.
I think the events of the last 2 days show that this government has completely forfeited its right to govern. Anyone watching these events would just be asking what has happened to the authority of the government, what has happened to the authority of the Prime Minister. And more to the point, I think the whole country will be thinking, don't we deserve better than this? We need a government at a time of economic difficulty, at a time of political difficulty. We need a government that is strong, that is united, that has a purpose. Instead, we have a government in complete chaos. We really do deserve better than this. And I believe that all roads now, fairly, should lead towards a general election, whether it's dealing with the political crisis, whether it's the lack of authority of the Prime Minister, whether it's the collapse of this cabinet, whether it's the need for a fresh start in our country. Everything points in the same direction. We need that general election. Thank you.
Well, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, he's been weighing in, and his assessment was that this Labour government is now finished, regardless of what happens to Gordon Brown.
Whether Gordon Brown stays, whether Gordon Brown goes, whether someone replaces him, it's all irrelevant because the Labour government has run out of road. It's finished. We need something new, different, fresh in British politics, and that's why we need to give people a say, call a general election. The Labour Party has no right, at a time when people are crying out for help, to hold the whole country to hostage with its own splits and infighting.
That was Nick Clegg. Earlier, my colleague spoke to Douglas Alexander, the International Development Secretary, a close ally of Gordon Brown, and he gave this reaction to James Purnell's resignation and his views on how the Labour Party should move forward.
All of us, I think, have thought deeply and long about what's in the best interest, not just of the Labour Party, but much more importantly, what's in the best interest of the country. James was at a 2-hour cabinet meeting with me on Tuesday morning. On Wednesday, we stood together listening to Prime Minister's questions and discussed the exchange of views across the chamber. So I don't doubt that James has reached this decision after deep and serious consideration. But equally, it's possible for people to have thought deeply about it and reached a different conclusion. The conclusion I've reached is that if the Labour Party was now to turn inwards, to turn away from the concerns of the people watching this programme at home who are worried about mortgages or about holding on to their jobs, then I think that would be the wrong course of action.
Well, that was Douglas Alexander. Very interesting there, him talking about the Labour Party turning in on itself. Let me bring you breaking news from John Prescott, former Deputy Leader, because he's been writing on his blog and has been savage about the aspects of the leadership in their approach to the local council elections, saying there has been non-campaigning. They were resigned to defeat. They lacked the will to fight. He specifically mentions Douglas Alexander. He also mentions at length Harriet Harman. So some fierce criticism from John Prescott in terms of the leadership, making the point that the election results were not just down to this the expensive scandal we've seen so much of in the last few weeks, but specifically talking about non-campaigning in terms of the top echelons of the party. Let's go back to James Landale there in Downing Street. More on the reshuffle, James, in a moment, but your assessment of those comments from John Prescott, first of all.
Well, John Prescott is carving out quite an interesting niche now as a vocal voice of the grassroots of the Labour Party. He has this independent voice now. He's rare amongst those Labour politicians in actually having the weight, but also the experience to express his own opinion on these things. Normally, he's pretty loyal, but those words are pretty stinging in terms of his criticism of the Labour leadership. Note, however, though, that it's not a direct criticism of the Prime Minister. John Prescott has spent much of the last decade trying to keep Tony Blair and Gordon Brown together. He was the guy who famously had them in together at his flat just up the road here at Admiralty House for those little suppers, just the three of them, trying to get the two men to talk and cooperate. But clearly he is somebody who has spent the last 4 to 5 weeks on the road out there campaigning and is expressing his frustration now at what he sees as the shenanigans of the Labour leadership at the heart of government here in Westminster.
What is the latest you are hearing with the reshuffle itself?
Well, I have to say, things have slowed up a bit. They were in a little bit of a hiatus. There was an initial flurry where we got a fair amount of news out about some positions, but at the moment, there seems to be a pause in operations. We're not entirely sure why. We don't know whether it is caused by John Hutton's decision to resign, not just from Cabinet, but also announce his resignation as an MP at the next election. But certainly there is a pause going on. There's, I don't know whether there's a hiccup. I don't know whether they're just drawing breath or whether they're carrying on making those calls. But certainly there is not the usual flow of information that we had at the beginning of the day. I have to say, one of the most extraordinary things about this reshuffle we've seen so far is just the sheer ubiquity of ministers on the ground. Matthew, you've had minister after minister coming up to be interviewed in a way that I've never seen at any reshuffle before, in my experience. And I think it's just emblematic, symbolic of the fact that this is a defensive reshuffle, not a proactive one.
OK, James there in Downing Street. Thanks once again. Plenty more from James and from me here in just a moment or two. But let us pause to catch up with the weather details, and that's with John Hammond. John.
Thank you, Matthew. Storm clouds gathering over Westminster. Not only Westminster, for some of us, it's going to be a very wet weekend indeed. Specifically at the moment across the Scottish borders into the far north of England. Heavy and persistent rain here. It's likely to rain for much of the day. Very cold as well, just 6 or 7 degrees in a number of places. And we really are quite concerned about heavy rain over the course of the weekend, because in some places we could see as much as 2 or 3 inches when all is said and done, and that could pose some problems. Through the rest of the day, it stays wet across the far north of England, showers breaking out across the Midlands, Wales. The best of the brightness across the west of Scotland, Northern Ireland, the far south of England, in any sunshine. Temperatures getting as high as 17 or 18 degrees. Through the night, it continues wet across northern England, and the rain spreads into other parts of the Midlands and Wales. Here, a very wet weekend indeed.
This is BBC News. The headlines at 11 o'clock. I'm Matthew Amariwala, covering the events live here at Westminster, where the Prime Minister is trying to reassert his authority this morning. Well, Gordon Brown is reshuffling his cabinet as we speak. Alan Johnson becomes the new Home Secretary. Alistair Darling stays as Chancellor. John Hutton